Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center. I am Jeffrey Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution which has booming voices overcoming us, and now mine booms out just as Congress's voice boomed out when it created this beautiful institution with an inspiring mission: to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a non-partisan basis. Beautiful. Yes, authorization is crucial, and we now have it, and we're going to have an incredible discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, this program I think is going to be incredibly illuminating, and I can't wait to learn with you from three people who must be the greatest journalist of Congress in America today, Carl Hulse from the New York Times, the greatest historian and political scientist writing about Congress, David Mayhew of Yale University, and the greatest constitutional scholar writing about the constitutional aspects of Congress's performance, and that is Josh Chafetz of Cornell. What's so exciting to bring these scholars and thinkers together is this is a part of this phenomenal initiative we've launched that some of you know about called a Madisonian Constitution for All. This is a commission co-chaired by leading Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate asking, what would Madison think of our current Congress, presidency, courts, and media, and how can we resurrect Madisonian values of public deliberation today? We launched on April 13th, Freedom Day, with a rather sober discussion of Congress as the broken branch with Mickey Edwards and Norm Ornstein. And what is exciting to me is that I think our scholars and thinkers tonight may be a little more optimistic. Optimism may be too strong. Modified rapture, perhaps, might be the right word. But these are deeply interesting and surprising books, which, of course, I want you to read, and I want you to join me in welcoming them now. Josh Chafetz, David Mayhew, and Carl Hulse.
Okay.
Welcome. All right. Welcome. Better. Okay, so glad you are here. Carl, your New York Times colleague has a piece in this morning's paper about the many ways that Congress and the Republicans are checking President Trump, and you are writing a piece on a similar topic of ways that Democrats and Republicans are cooperating in opposition to the president's agenda. Tell us about the state of play as it comes to the president and Congress in Washington.
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me up here. This is hallowed ground for us political government geeks, so it's great to be here and talk about this stuff. You know, the question has been with a lot of people, what's happened to Congress? Where is Congress's power gone? And you know, the dirty secret is that they've given up a lot of it on their own, that they don't want to be accountable. They'd rather have a president make some of the tough decisions. So what we have now, and I think you've seen this building over the past few administrations, really, there are people in Congress who want to try and get some of this power back. Now, whether or not they can is another question. And I think the Trump administration is presenting a challenge to them as to whether or not they can fulfill, you know, their more traditional constitutional duty of being, you know, Article 1, right? So I think what you're seeing, even though most people don't notice it, that there is a bit of a pushback on Trump in some ways in Congress right now, and what you mentioned, Jennifer Steinhauer's story today, is one. Let's just take that, the sanctions bill that passed the Senate last week, large vote, 90 bipartisan vote. Within that legislation is a provision that the Democrats and Republicans agreed on, that if the president was going to do anything about those new sanctions on Russia, he would have to come back to Congress. So there is, you know, sort of beneath the surface, there's some quiet efforts to assert themselves. I started to see this at the end of the Bush administration, W, when his numbers were low and there was some real popular resistance to him, the parties coming together. But also tomorrow, I noticed that there's a big press conference involving Senator Blumenthal of Connecticut and Congressman Conyers, the top Democrat on the Judiciary Committee, and they're going to try and force President Trump to abide by the emoluments clause in the Constitution, and the problem there is I don't see any Republicans participating in that press conference tomorrow. So, there's little movement going on, but I think the Senate is the place to watch. I don't think you're going to see a lot of tough oversight at all in the House. And just one last point on this is, to me, part of the deterioration of the congressional prerogative has been parties in Congress have just found themselves too aligned with the president at the time. They think their political future rides on what happens with the president. That wasn't always the case. Congressmen used to, even when I got to Washington, even 30 some years ago, Congress, the big leaders in Congress, they saw themselves as the power, and they were going to be there for a while. The presidents come and go. And someone like Tip O'Neill, or if you want to go back to Sam Rayburn, they considered themselves to be the government and were willing to assert themselves. You just don't see that now, and we'll have to see what happens with Trump.
Fascinating. Just for the constitutional point, remember the Foreign Emoluments Clause says that no official of the United States can accept any favor of any foreign king or president without the consent of Congress. So the fact that the Democrats are now saying you need our consent before you can accept.
Before you can take that money at the hotel.
Absolutely. And is a good example of constitutional textualism. And you've also given us examples of how it's when Congress is in opposition to the president, even when they're of the same party, that they're moved to resist. Josh, I think that leads me to ask you to introduce your notion of non-legislative powers. In this absolutely fascinating book, you talk about the many ways that Congress can act with hard and soft powers, ranging from its power over the purse to its powers of investigation. Tell us about what some of those powers are and how they may be being activated in the age of Trump.
Sure. So, well, first of all, I want to add my thanks for having me here. This is really fantastic to be part of this panel and to be up here with two people I've long admired. So I'm interested in sort of things that Congress is doing when it isn't passing laws, and I think these are actually the things that have the greatest likelihood of checking a president, whether the president's of the same party or of the opposite party, because of course passing laws, you have to get past a presidential veto. Presidential vetoes are almost never overridden. So I'm interested in things like in the budget process, the ability to either reduce budget in a targeted way or even go all the way and shut down the government as sort of a tool of opposition. I'm interested in sort of things like refusing to confirm nominees, in holding hearings and sort of what results out of those hearings. And I think to some extent we can see a lot of those sort of in play already. So I completely agree with Carl that we're more likely to see significant opposition coming out of the Senate in this Congress than out of the House. But even in the House, I mean, so right now we've got 4 different congressional committees investigating ties between the Trump campaign and then administration and Russia, 2 in the House, 2 in the Senate. And I think a lot of people are rightly focused on sort of, well, where are those committees going? What's going to come out of that? But the mere fact that they've been holding these hearings, right, which requires Republican buy-in, the fact that Comey testified when he was still director of the FBI before the House Intelligence Committee in open session, which resulted in the acknowledgement that Trump was under FBI investigation. Right? I mean, we've had all of these blockbuster hearings. We're only 170 days into this presidency. Had all of these blockbuster hearings coming out of both houses. The mere fact that those hearings happened at all required Republican buy-in. We've seen Republicans say, for example, that a lot of the more controversial aspects of the president's proposed budget are certainly going nowhere. We've seen almost no sort of movement on a legislative agenda out of this Congress, even though the president's party controls both houses. I think we will, we've seen an administration that is remarkably slow to staff up. But I think as more people start getting nominated, especially the nominee for the new director of the FBI and things like that, the Senate is going to start asking tougher questions and using those kinds of prerogatives. So I think there are all of these mechanisms of pushback that don't involve actually passing laws that have kicked into gear even under Republican-dominated both houses of Congress. And I think to the extent that Trump remains unpopular, and especially unpopular with elites within the Republican Party, we'll see even more of this. One thing that I know someone like Carl is acutely attuned to, leaks. Right? So there are a whole bunch of Democrats and a whole bunch of Republicans who have access to information the public doesn't have access to. Right? Leaking is a time-honored congressional prerogative, and the more that members of Congress see it as in their interest to do things that bring this administration down a peg, the more we're going to see things in the New York Times and maybe a few lesser papers as well that actually sort of perform that function. Right? So even if formally some of these investigations don't go anywhere, we're going to see results coming out of them in formats like that. So I think there are all of these things that Congress does, that individual houses do, that individual members of Congress do, that in some sense we're all aware of, but in some sense we don't tend to think of when we're asking, is Congress doing anything? Is Congress doing its job? These are all part of its job. These are all things that members of Congress do as part of their day-to-day professional life, and we're seeing them happen. And so I think that's a sort of, as you suggest in your introduction, perhaps a slightly more optimistic spin than someone like, say, Norm Ornstein might have on the current Congress.
It'd be hard to be less optimistic than Norm. His last book is It's Even Worse Than You Think when it comes to Congress, and the next one is Go Lie Down and Have a Drink. It's worse yet. But both of, and we're going to have a great podcast on leaks and its constitutionality recorded tomorrow, published on Thursday, and are looking forward to exploring that. Both of the functions that Carl and Josh have talked about are negative functions of checking the president. But David, in your creative and remarkably illuminating book, The Imprint of Congress, you identify 13 impulses that have both defined American history and have been global to a degree. And you say that in many of them, it was Congress, not the executive, that was the chief leverager of policy change. They start with the launch of a new nation and continental expansion. They include taming the corporations during the Progressive era, and they conclude with neoliberalizing the economy, addressing climate change, and containing the debt and deficit. It's an incredible historical tour, but give us a sense of why, broadly, you feel that Congress really has been more of a driver than executive in many of these areas.
Well, you got it correct, that I took 13 impulses starting in the 1790s right through today, building a new nation, eventually building a welfare state, taking out after the rich and the corporations around in 1900, that sort of thing, dealing with climate change today. I tried to work all those through to find out, putting the U.S. also in international perspective, that as the U.S. has performed in these really transnational impulses. So what's been the Congress's place and all that? And I think it's, there are some things to say. The Congress, in presidential systems, there are a lot in the world. The U.S. Congress is constitutionally strong in these systems compared with in other countries. It has awesome legislative powers, investigative powers, which Josh writes about. It's budgetary powers. As presidents can't just say, this is my budget, you've got to do it. It has to be done on the Hill. He can't even introduce. He can't call a national referendum. That's a great blessing. Can you imagine if a president could, on his own hook, call a national referendum? In some countries, a president can do that. It's just a wonderful thing that an American president can't do that. And Congress is really very strong. Now, Congress kicks around. Generally speaking, Congress is unpopular. I mean, it's down in the 20s right now, it's in the teens last year. And seldom is it very high. You got to look for some just occasional instances where it rises over 50% when everything the government is doing is popular, like just after, during the Civil Rights Revolution in the 60s, or just after 9/11. You get a blip there where Congress goes over 50%. But generally speaking, it's in the cellar. And it's, why is it in the cellar? Well, it's in the, because people fight. They go to Capitol and they fight. They fuss and they fight, and it's messy. That in itself creates a reaction. I say it's probably in recent times, currently they're slipping a bit, Congress vis-a-vis the presidency, probably a little more congestion, a little more clogging, a little more complexity down there. I think some of these things could be fixed in a fashion that would be helpful to the system and to them. But Congress is always there, and there's some interesting polling data. I mean, the president takes the lead in the American system. That's clear enough. The president usually is first mover, certainly in foreign policy, but also in domestic policy. The president proposes a budget, even though the president can't bring it to Capitol Hill. The president makes, gets out there and puts out tweets. The president tweets. Generally speaking, Congress doesn't tweet. The president tweets. That happens. But all the way back, I mean, Franklin Roosevelt was tweeting in his own fashion with fireside addresses back then. The president takes the initiative. But there's interesting polling data over the last 60 years or so. You go out and ask the public. And this is even though the presidents have gotten stronger, more Rooseveltian, more, more diktats. They've become, in some respects, like Ottoman sultans, that as they put out diktats, and then a new president comes in, it's a different sultan, and the old diktats are revoked, and we get new diktats. We're seeing that come down right now. The degree to which presidents do that now is quite striking. But nonetheless, the public, who should be making the laws? And overwhelmingly, people say Congress. And then you ask the public, well, I mean, what's going on Capitol Hill? Is it that they just can't get their act together? Is it just that conflict is a natural sort of thing that happens in society, and people sign on to the second? They see that there's a certain shrewdness out in the public. This conflict is natural, and Congress should make the laws, despite it all, despite the fact that they're down in the cellar, the teens and the 20s out there. In this book, I carried through the history through these various impulses, and a couple of general conclusions come out of it. That is probably over time, and after all, this is 227 years now, and it's a very stable regime, except for the Civil War. It doesn't fall apart the way a lot of regimes do fall apart, after all. I mean, French constitutions used to be pretty common. It's the Congress probably does have a legitimizing effect in the public. That is, for one thing, it checks the president. It checks the president. Presidents can be screwy. I mean, in presidential systems, you take a chance. Almost anybody can buck for the top job in a presidential system. You can get ideologues. You can get people who are not very competent. You can get people who are sick. You can get Pied Pipers. You can get people who want to be caudillos in presidential systems that are favored up, who become caudillos in presidential systems out there. You got to watch them. And the checking function, as Josh writes about it through investigations and various other devices, is just continually important. And the strength that Congress has in supplying this checking, doing the checking, probably has a legitimizing effect in the American regime. It's for one thing, Congress is prone, usually anyway, when it does something that's long-lasting, to do it by cross-party majorities. It's big majorities. As Congress passes the Social Security Act in 1935, there are big Democratic majorities on the Hill, but most Republicans, as well as most Democrats, signed on to the Social Security Act when it was passed. That kind of result is very important. You get that kind of lawmaking, and you might be getting something that could last, that's legitimized with the public. And Congress fairly commonly acts in that fashion, though not always. Last point is this one, though. A generalization is that congressional action is pretty messy. That's one thing that makes unhappy with Capitol. It's messy. They tinker with laws. They make it very difficult to administer laws because they're always changing them. They're doing this, adding that, subtracting that. I mean, 80 or 90 different additions to the Social Security Act since 1935, which makes it kind of, it keeps improving it, but it makes the whole thing difficult and complicated to administer, for example. All that's out there. The tax code is a mess, and it's difficult, complicated out there. The messiness, but that does I think the messiness, Congress, it has an off-putting effect. It does probably induce Americans to worry about Congress getting very deep into running things, actually operating things. Like the one thing about the U.S. is that it's a very private capitalist place. It's generally speaking, the government doesn't try to invent companies and run them the way it operates them, the way it happens in many different countries, France, for example. And I would guess there's an aversion to letting Congress get its hands on units that are supposed to be productive. That is, you can imagine Congress running Microsoft. It probably wouldn't work very well. That having been said, I mean, they put together a decent welfare state system, a decent tax code, and it travels through time. And Congress is maybe losing some of its clout vis-a-vis the administration, but I think some of it can be taken back. In fact, right now, I think maybe, what with Trump, there may be reaction against the president's being so executive directive happy. I mean, even the Democrats in the law schools may come to figure that maybe it's not such a great idea to be cheerleading for the executive branch and the bureaucrats all the time.
Absolutely. A bunch of really important points in that great statement. The last one, that executive orders, which you earlier called diktats, were ones that both parties tended to approve when their guy was doing it, but now both sides are realizing the dangers of the imperial presidency. And such an important point David made about the idea that the president can't call a referendum. No Brexit in America. That was Madison's nightmare. Madison says no tweeting presidents. The presidents are not supposed to communicate directly with their representative, and we're supposed to have thoughtful deliberation rather than one-off votes. And David is putting that in historical context and says that over time, Congress has achieved a tremendous amount, even though it's messy. So Carl, take us, why is it then, Carl, that the conventional wisdom is that Congress is the broken branch, to use the title of Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein's book? You were at Capitol Hill in the aftermath of the shooting last Wednesday in Alexandria. And in a piece published that day, you said such gatherings like the congressional baseball game cannot mask the acrid partisan atmosphere in Congress, as well as back home, where lawmakers say they're increasingly worried about hostile audiences and constituents filled with vitriol who are unrestrained in venting at their member of Congress. We've seen these town halls where constituents are literally yelling at the Congress people, and there's a perception, anyway, that things are more partisan. Are they? You've been covering it for a while, so take it historically.
Well, that was really well written, I have to say.
What's that?
It was really well written.
Well, it was beautiful. No, I read it with loving respect because it was so powerful.
A couple of things I wanted to respond to. Yeah, one, I think one thing you'll see in the 2018 elections, the Democrats running on, we are the check on Trump. That's going to be their overriding theme. Two, and this kind of gets to your point, there is a lot of conflict and it's messy. And right now the problem is that the conflict is among the Republicans. They have a problem getting themselves together. The opposition to Obama really papered over a lot of their problems. Now they're in charge and they're having a really hard time getting it together. And also the reference to, you need to pass things on a big bipartisan vote. Look at the health care. I mean, that was all Democratic votes, and it's been a fight ever since. But people always ask me, is this the worst? I've been there since '85. I wasn't there for the Civil War, but I presume it was probably a little worse then. But it is bad. It's bad, and there's a lot of reasons it's bad. We're part of the reason it's bad. The media and social media, the 24-hour news cycle. We've been through all that before. But I think one thing that the shooting last week exposed in the coverage afterwards is there's very little comity and camaraderie among Republicans and Democrats. They just don't really know each other. They have little to do with each other. This was, the baseball game, which was the next night. It's one of the few events that actually kind of brings them together. I was talking to a Democratic senator one time, and I said, so what do you think of Mitch McConnell, And she was like, well, I've only really talked to him once on the floor briefly. That wasn't always the case, People, even if you fought it out on the floor, people knew each other, they would be in various dinners together. And I think it is particularly ugly right now, and that, the stakes are big, and as we were talking beforehand, that Georgia special election is going to cost between $40 and $50 million for this special election. It's just an outrageous sum of money. And it's actually, to me, it's kind of offensive. And a lot of it is being spent on super negative things, right? There was a Republican official down there today was quoted on the record as talking about how that shooting was going to help their candidate because they can show that, do you want to elect more crazy Democrats? I mean, so this is less than a week, only a few days after the shooting. And, those people aren't in Washington. But I think that this is an extremely difficult time, and it's going to take some work for them to be able to get past this.
That notion that you so powerfully described of the senator never talking to the majority leader
Of the other party. Yeah.
is new. So our new chair is Vice President Biden. We're very excited about, and he has talked publicly and also to the Constitution Center about how when he started in Congress a long time ago, senators from both sides would eat together in the Senate dining room every day for 20 years, and they got to know each other, and they knew that their kids were sick or they had prostate cancer or something, and were able to be friends, even civil rights activists like him and Southern segregationists. And he thought that lack of face-to-face
Yeah, it's hard to
contact
hate
had done a lot.
someone if you know in that setting. If you go into the Senate dining room now, the tables honestly are empty a lot of the times. Nobody really eats in the Senate dining room. It's certainly as much as they used to. It's a different era. People sleep not in the Senate. No one that I know of in the Senate sleeps in their office, I don't think. But you do see it in the House, and it makes a difference.
Okay, Josh, lots to connect the perception of polarization to your phenomenal book. We had an incredible podcast on the filibuster, and Josh argued, well, I'm not allowed to take sides, but he argued powerfully that the filibuster was unconstitutional, and you also talked about its use being transformed starting in the 90s, really, 80s and 90s, to totally be an agent for paralysis rather than just slowing stuff down. So what are some of the constitutional or structural changes that have made comedy and cooperation more difficult, and how, despite this polarization, are you still confident that Congress can fulfill its checking functions?
Well, things are always worse than they used to be, right? That there's a sort of natural human instinct towards that. I mean, so in 1792, Jeffersonian Representative Matthew Lyon was actually put on trial for seditious libel by a Federalist grand jury in his home state of Vermont. In the middle decades of the 19th century, there were repeated brawls on the floor of both the House and the Senate. In 1855, Thomas Hart Benton, a Democratic senator from Missouri, drew and cocked a loaded pistol on the Senate floor at his Democratic colleague, Henry Foote of Mississippi. Everybody knows about the caning of Charles Sumner on the floor. In 1903, a couple of Democrats from South Carolina on the Senate floor got into a brawl. That's actually the brawl that it was over the issue of Philippine annexation. That was actually the brawl that led to the rule about personalities on the Senate floor that Senator Warren was, of course, asked to sit down for violating earlier this year. So the idea that there's this sort of mythical period of comedy that we can, COMITY, that we can look back to and sort
also
of,
the other one.
well, yeah.
Stop.
This idea that there was a time when they all really got along. There have been times when they have gotten along better, times when they've gotten along worse, and there have, I think, really importantly, been times when those divisions have tracked partisanship and times when they haven't. We are in a period right now of relatively ideologically unified parties, which means that most of the disagreements are going to fall out along partisan lines. There have been plenty of other periods in American history where we've had relatively unified parties, and in those periods, it hasn't been surprising to see even major pieces of legislation, the kind of stuff that David writes out about, being fairly party line, right? So in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, right, Reconstruction legislation was almost entirely a party line. That was also a moment of really intense partisan polarization. That fell apart to a large extent in the middle of the 20th century for reasons that we should not be happy about, which is to say that the segregationist impulse was sectional, not partisan. It cut across party lines, and therefore, you had significant racist contingents in both the Democratic and the Republican Party, which means, hey, we can get bipartisanship, right? But that's not a good thing. That is not something we should be happy about. And it's really the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that begins the process of the sort of ideological sorting that we have now. But that takes time to play out, right? Because people serve in Congress for an awfully long time, right? This is what Carl was sort of alluding to earlier, right? You assume presidents come and go, but committee chairmen are forever. And so it took a long time for the sort of changes that begin in the electorate in the mid to late 1960s to actually play out. You see a lot of this in the 80s when members like Phil Gramm actually sort of switch parties, right? Gramm from Texas had been a lifelong Democrat. In the mid 80s switches and becomes a Republican, which he remains for the rest of his career. That's part of that sorting process. And then part of it, of course, is just liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats retiring and being replaced by members of the other party. So you get that sort of sorting occurring, and then that leads things to be more partisan, right? As a result of that ideological sorting, the debates shake out more along partisan lines than they used to. That doesn't mean necessarily that we're more divided or more polarized. It just means actually the two parties are doing a better job representing their bases in some sense. But it has knock-on effects on things, on procedural issues like the filibuster, right? It means that it becomes easier, especially because of the way that party apparatus is used to organize legislative behavior within the houses of Congress. It means that it becomes easier to rationalize taking the filibuster from a tool to be used only in situations in which someone felt extraordinarily intense preferences. And by the way, that throughout most of the 20th century was civil rights bills. Right? For most of the 20th century, the things that fell to filibusters were civil rights legislation. And sort of becomes increasingly routinized, really starting in the 1970s. And that's partly related to the political polarization story. It's also partly an unintended consequence of things that were, of some sort of minor reforms that were actually meant to make the Senate run better. The institution of what's called the two-track system. It used to be that if you wanted to filibuster, you had to hold the floor. You were holding up all other business. This was the sort of classic Mr. Smith goes to Washington filibuster. In the 70s, Majority Leader Mansfield introduces what's called the two-track system so that other legislation can proceed while one thing is being filibustered. That was meant to make the Senate work better, right? It was meant to allow non-controversial legislation to go forward. What it actually did is massively lower the cost of filibustering because all of your colleagues aren't mad that you're holding up their thing while you're filibustering your thing. And so that contributed to the routinization of the filibuster as well, such that by the 1990s, it really had ceased to be about unlimited debate. It had ceased to be about debate at all. In fact, what a filibuster did by that point was stop all debate on an issue and just serve as a standing supermajority requirement. And so I think the polarization of the parties that we've been talking about plays into that. A lot of other things play into that, as well.
Fascinating. I'm tempted to ask you to tell our friends why the filibuster is unconstitutional, but listen to the podcast and you'll hear Josh's great arguments.
It's not in the Constitution, that's for sure. So.
Oh, no, maybe later. As a bonus question, if one of you wants to ask it, we can do it. David, you've heard Carl and Josh, you argue in the book that it's not right that Congress is more polarized today than ever. Tell us why. Give us some historical examples of times when Congress was polarized, and if it's not polarization that's increased, are things more fractious or not?
Polarization is difficult to measure. You could do it with roll call data back to 1789, but you got to be careful. That's only so much you could do with roll call data. This is a time of polarization, no question about it, polarization. By the way, Congress is a representative body. It's not that Congress is causing polarization. Congress is largely expressing or picking up polarization. It's out there in the society. It's the society that's polarized. And sometimes the society is polarized. I mean, the apex of polarization was back in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, when after all they warmed up to kill each other and then they killed each other in the 1860s in very large numbers, very large numbers. I mean, it would be the equivalent of killing 7.5 million people in the population today, what happened in the Civil War. This is real polarization. But we shouldn't overlook that there are times which exhibit very intense polarization, but they don't last very long. But we can remember, if we think about them, as during the Vietnam War. It's very difficult for either the society or the Congress to get more polarized than was the case right then. Or the McCarthy era, when loyalty scares and such. That was a time of Republicans pressing very hard on that one and against the Truman administration, and for that matter, against Eisenhower. I think that, yes, surely today is a time of relative polarization. Yes, it's there, and We expect Congress to do its best to live with that and to try to get over it insofar as it's possible. But we also have to depend on presidents. I mean, presidents can be polarizers and they can be depolarizers. I mean, an instance of a president who was a great depolarizer was Eisenhower. I can remember it. I mean, the country was very polarized when Eisenhower took over. There was the McCarthyism, the Korean War, and within a couple of years, he'd sort of drawn the fangs away from things. Eisenhower did by acting as he did in the White House. Presidents can do that too. They don't have to be dividers. We depend on pretty much, we should depend on them for that.
Can you think of any president who's a polarizer?
On a nonpartisan
I
basis.
can think
is
of
our
a
motto
very
here.
long list, actually, now that you ask.
Any current examples?
So, Carl, will the Senate Republicans, since you mentioned it, in fact check the president in a meaningful way, or in the end will party loyalty prevail?
You know, I hate to dodge like a politician, but I just think we have to wait and see. I think we have to wait and see what the events are. They're not so far, although I thought Josh made a really great point. The Republicans probably aren't getting enough credit right now for the investigations that are going on. I think, you know, there's been political pressure, but Richard Burr, who was not that keen on this investigation, he did a good job at that Comey hearing. I mean, you know, that committee is acting in a fairly bipartisan manner right now, and there's a middle of that. But, you know, overall, Chuck Grassley recently said he was going to hold up a nominee until the administration started to respond to some of these oversight questions. So you're seeing a bit of that, but the big explosion, you know, where, you know, we're breaking from the president, I think we have to see how things progress. You know, the people now say, well, if he was to fire Robert Mueller and Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein, would that be, you know, cause a rupture with the Republicans, and would they reimpose the independent counsel law and do it themselves? I don't know what's going to happen. I think that there are some things under the radar that show that they are taking him on a bit, and also that they're willing to do stuff with the Democrats to try and do this. But, you know, what will there be this big one? I just don't know.
Can I just add one thing on that? So we tend to forget that with Democrats in control of both houses of Congress, it was still over 2 years from the Watergate break-in until Nixon's resignation. Right? It's easy to be impatient when things aren't going the way that one wants them to go. But you know, the ship of state is large and slow-moving, and it would be shocking. You know, again, we're less than half a year into this presidency. It would be with both parties of Congress in the hands of the president's party. What's shocking is actually, to me at least, the degree of pushback we've seen, not the idea that somehow we should have already seen significantly more than this.
We're in instant gratification era politically, and everybody thinks it's like a half-hour TV show. Okay, let's move on, and you know,
You're fired.
Yeah. And this is gonna.
You're impeached, yeah.
This is. It's actually in some ways moving way faster than you would have thought.
But David, one of your important points is that the system was not set up for quick results, but for thoughtful deliberation. So can you imagine this Congress, which disagrees with the president on a lot of policy issues, taking the lead in policy making in the way that Congress has previously, or not?
Taking a lead in policy making. Yes, I can. Let me say that it's early, this Congress. It's only about 5 months in. And we should give them a break, I think. Any Congress, give them a break. I mean, they get beat up on. They get beat up on, particularly by the media, on lawmaking, on you know, trying to enact laws. Like recently we had a round of 100 days have gone past and they haven't done anything. You know, you probably read those stories.
Well, unfortunately, they had promised to do a lot.
What's that again?
They had a promise to do a lot, though. That was, you know,
Well,
they
yes.
set their own standard on that.
Exactly, but they're crazy. Nobody should believe their promises.
Now you're getting to it.
That isn't the way things happen. It is. I will look back. There's the 100 days back in 1933 with Roosevelt. I look back the the first 100 days of a new president's administration since then, virtually nothing happens legislative-wise. Since Roosevelt, when there's a big crisis, after all, the depression.
And Obama.
And Obama, when there's a big
because-
Obama, actually, the stimulus bill in February '09 is the only important piece of legislation enacted since 1933 during the first 100 days of a new president's term. That's it, period. I mean, the rest of the stuff, it comes in calendar 2010.
Yeah. Now, they would say the Lilly Ledbetter Pay
Pardon?
Equity Act that they passed immediately.
That's not
They
a-
had set
that's not a
themselves
big
up
deal.
to pass a few bills. They knew they wanted to score some.
You're talking about the day right now, the Trumpians?
No, the Obama when he not major legislation, but he did pass
Yeah,
some
but that was a
legislation.
small beer compared with the stimulus.
Yeah. Oh, totally.
Stimulus is
I
big.
agree with that. But last week was the first amendment actually voted on the Senate floor this year. So that's pretty bad.
Generally, you look at the newspaper, you write the newspapers. If you look at the newspapers in these terms, it becomes May and June, and not much has happened. That's typical. That's what you'd expect. You got 535 people running loose down there, and they have to come to agreement on something. It's not very surprising. Whether now, I really don't know whether they can. Whose agenda is it? It's Trump's. It's theirs. It's more theirs than Trump's. Basically, I think the domestic legislation. It's hard to say. I think that they might. It's hard to say. It's sometimes when a new president comes in, the important enactments come in the second year. I mean, actually, that was true. The stimulus aside, that was true with Obama in 2010. It's true with Eisenhower. Virtually everything under Eisenhower came in his second year. It's a tax reform. Tax cuts can be done pretty quickly sometimes because everybody likes tax cuts. But tax reform, where you try to manipulate the whole schedule and do something, almost never can that be done quickly in a president's term.
There are, first of all, friends in the audience, thank you for these spectacular questions. Look at all these amazing questions, and they're so substantive and so thoughtful that I want to get through a bunch of them. There are a whole bunch on gerrymandering, and people ask, they note that the court just today agreed to hear what could be the most important gerrymandering case of the new century, deciding whether extreme partisan gerrymandering violates the Constitution. And a whole bunch of people ask a version of, do you think fixing gerrymandering will help depolarize Congress? I'll just note that we had a phenomenal debate on, is gerrymandering responsible for polarization? And Norbert McCarthy of Princeton argued persuasively to the audience, because they voted before and after, that polarization was not the fault of gerrymandering. It was the fault of the fact that people are sorting themselves into filter bubbles and geographic entities. And if there's polarization, it comes from a different cause. So your thoughts on that, and if you don't think that it's gerrymandering that's responsible for polarization, what could fix polarization?
So I think gerrymandering probably has some small impact on polarization within Congress. I think gerrymandering also probably has some small, although smaller than most people tend to assume, impact on the mismatch between something like popular vote in House elections and seat share. A lot of that, but a lot of it is what you alluded to, and what Nolan McCarty has been talking about, which is that Democrats are more clustered than Republicans geographically in the United States. And so it's really, first of all, it's really hard to figure out what it means to draw neutral district lines. The alternative to gerrymandering isn't no gerrymandering, it's just a different gerrymander. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't better and worse, but you have to decide what your sort of normative commitments are before you decide whether this gerrymander is particularly egregious or not egregious. But I think sort of however you draw district lines, you're going to wind up, given the sort of distribution of people in American society today, you're going to wind up with certain kinds of mismatches between overall popular vote and seat share, and you're going to wind up with somewhat polarized political parties. Given our sort of, this is what David was talking about, given our the current state of play in American society at large, that's not inevitable and it's probably not permanent, but it is where we are right now.
David, just to pick up on that, if gerrymandering is not responsible for polarization, Josh says it's responsible for the mismatch between overall vote and seat share. If the Supreme Court were to strike down extreme partisan gerrymanders, would that decrease incumbency control and the lock that Republicans have?
Would it what?
Would it decrease the lock that at the moment Republicans have on certain legislatures, or would it not have any significant effect?
Probably wouldn't make much difference. I think Josh is right that the chief thing going on is clustering. That is, you can walk across Manhattan without meeting a Republican, but you can't walk across Kansas without meeting a Democrat. I mean, Manhattan is about 85%, and Kansas is about 3-2, and that's an exaggeration of what's out there. You see, Democrats cluster; they group up their folks, and therefore, in the whole national scheme of things, they waste votes, so to speak. So the result of this is that across the whole country, and this has been true for 60 years at least, I've looked, there's a slight Republican edge in the House universe because of the clustering effect. And intentional partisan gerrymandering is not very important compared with the clustering effect. In fact, it's really not very important at all. The slight Republican advantage in the House through that 1 or 2% is about the same as they have in the Senate. That is about the same kind of little Republican edge in the Senate districts, so to speak, which are states. But it's small in both cases. But people get too excited about gerrymandering. I wish we could do something about gerrymandering. And I really like the commission results that have come down lately in California and New York and Arizona and Iowa for a long time. I think that there should be more of that. But the chief unfortunate effect of the gerrymandering business is that people use it or key on it to delegitimize the House, where really it doesn't make much difference.
Can I say something on that? So Elbridge Gerry
Well pronounced, sir. Gerrymandering.
Is buried in Congressional Cemetery in D.C. by my house. And I used to walk my dog there a lot. And I would always walk by. He's got a really nice tomb and say, if you only knew what your name had become, you'd be shot. I'm for nonpartisan commissions doing it, letting politicians draw the lines. It's always going to be some kind of fooling around. So if we can get to something that's a little better, I do think that certain states, Wisconsin being one of them, end up with overrepresentation of that legislature, and Illinois in reverse. The Illinois legislature is well known for its devious acts, and they did it in the other way. So the amount of politics you can take out of it, the better off you are.
But just so I understand this, because it's so important and all of you asked about it, why should we care about gerrymandering, if we want to be pedantic, if it's not responsible for polarization?
I think more than these guys. This is the difference between a reporter and people who actually study things.
You're being too modest.
They think the long-term effects aren't as bad, but I see some of the immediate effects. And year to year, I think that I think we should do what we could about it.
I think we should get rid of it. It looks bad, and it is bad on the merits. And in some states, it has an effect. This is independent of the generalization that, generally speaking, policy-wise and representation-wise, it doesn't make much difference.
So one of our guests asked the follow-up question. You pointed out instances of fierce polarization in history, for example, the Civil War, fights against Congress members, et cetera. What's the response needed today to lessen polarization, Josh? And should we lessen it? Does it matter?
Right. So part of it is, again, something that we've said a couple times, that polarization in Congress will decrease when polarization in the public decreases. That Congress is sort of epiphenomenal, and it's not the phenomenon itself. It's not clear that, given the state of society today, we would necessarily want it to decrease. Again, it's not clear to me that polarization is necessarily a bad thing, right? It's not clear to me, for instance, in the aftermath of the Civil War, that we should look down on Reconstruction statutes or the Reconstruction amendments because they were Republican Party initiatives and the Democrats weren't on board, right? I mean, we should look back and say the Democrats were wrong and were standing up for an evil system, but we shouldn't say that there's something illegitimate about, the 14th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act of 1865, et cetera, because they were partisan. So I think we should be more concerned with policy outcomes than with bipartisanship, frankly.
So I mean, David, is there a problem with Congress? If gerrymandering is not really a problem, and if polarization isn't either, is it working? What would Madison have thought? Is it working the way it was supposed to?
What was it again?
Is there a problem with Congress?
I tell you, I think maybe at least this. Take it over the last 30 years or so. It's gotten more congested and more complicated, Congress. It's partly because of the way the Budget Act works. The Budget and Accounting Act of 1974 it is a paradise for walks. But for
Sounds
the
like the
rest
Constitution
of us,
sounded.
it's almost entirely impossible to understand, and that's not a good thing. A legislature should be transparent. People out there should be able to figure out what's going on in it.
You want to address the Senate healthcare deliberations on that then right now?
Absolutely. Transparency, absolutely. You got it. But the budget, I mean, year after year, we're just tangled up in this budgetary stuff. I mean, the committees we don't understand, the roads we don't understand, and they do everything at midnight on the last day, and it's really awful. I would just kill it. I'd just get rid of the budget. I'd keep the CBO, which is a nice research outfit, but go back to the status quo ante, which we have for 200 years after all. It's not clear to me that budgeting is done better since they passed that act in '74 than it was done for 200 years roughly before they passed it.
Oh, I have to come in on this. I'm sorry. If I could just...
Please.
So up until the early 20th century, the budget process was almost entirely run out of Congress. In fact, many executive departments the president never even saw their budget request. They just sent it, the secretary would send it straight to the congressional committees with jurisdiction, and that's how budgeting happened. The growth of the administrative state in the early 20th century put pressure on that and created a sort of perceived need for some kind of centralization, some kind of oversight body. And that's when you get the creation of the Budget Bureau in the Budget Act of 1920. The Budget Bureau then later becomes the Office of Management and Budget. And then you get what a lot of people call the era of presidential dominance of the budget process from 1920 to 1974. 1974, of course, is the immediate aftermath of Watergate, and essentially what you have is deep distrust in Congress and in the nation over the extent to which the White House was controlling policy, partly through the budget process. So that's when you get the '74 Budget Act that perhaps the mistake was not repealing the 20 Act and starting over, but essentially what it does is it layers congressional control on top of the executive control. So it doesn't get rid of OMB, the Office of Management and Budget in the White House, but instead it creates the budget committees, it creates CBO, it creates various other sort of mechanisms of congressional oversight, and creates the whole process where you get the budget resolutions and the appropriations bills. And it is incredibly complicated, but it's not, I think I disagree with David here, it's not irrationally so. It's a result of a sort of complicated history of back and forth of trying to sort of finally calibrate the degree of control that the White House on the one hand and the Congress on the other would have over the budget process, which, to be clear, is how a huge amount of American federal policy is made, right? We do a lot of policy through the budget, and so it's important to sort of calibrate that more precisely than it had been calibrated in the 5 decades leading up to the 1974 Act.
I look forward to coming back for one on Graham Rudman. We'll just go right to it. So on the
that's when it gets really exciting.
On the polarization, I mean, to me, here is the problem. You have we have to stop where someone who disagrees with you is the enemy and the devil, right? And we're kind of in that position right now. And I think, there's a lot of big problems in the United States that Congress could work on. But the two sides, to even align yourself with someone on the other side, can create a backlash in your district, especially in the House, but someone in the Senate, that you have to even be careful of working with the other side. You're not going to see a lot of Republicans try and work with Elizabeth Warren. The other day I was talking to an extremely high-ranking Republican member of Congress who's a big baseball fan, and I said, hey, I've got some good seats, maybe you should come down and we've taken a game together. And he said, and be seen in public with you? And I said, it would be bad for both our reputations. So, I mean, you have this feeling that you can't do anything with the other side. And I do think, publicly, and I think we got to get past that somehow.
David, I need to ask the question of the Madisonian Commission, because this is the homework that I have for the three of you, and it relates to this excellent question on thoughts of whether Congress' relative weakening is related to dilution of the people's voices, only 435 representatives for 300 million people. Madison proposes the very first amendment to the original Bill of Rights, which would have required 1 representative for every 4,000 inhabitants. If that had passed, there'd be something like 4,000 Congress people today, and he's concerned about having a republic large enough so faction doesn't prevail, majority or minority, but representative bodies that are connected enough to the people that they can represent their thoughtful voices. So it's a big but really crucial question. What would Madison think of Congress today, and how can we resurrect his vision?
Oh my God, I mean, the place was so small. We have 330 million people now, after all, and to try to devise a body which will represent it's just out of sight by Madison standards, to say nothing of extending the suffrage to sectors of the population they wouldn't even have considered. I mean, you could get a House district back then would have how many voters? 5,000, something like that? And now we can go up to 150, 200,000 in some districts. It's out of sight. I don't know what he would have thought. It's just, but still, I mean, the institutions that those folks built were pretty sturdy, generally speaking. I mean, they sketched them. They sketched them. It's not a 1,000-page Constitution. It's a short one. They sketched them, I think, quite successfully, given what's happened since.
That number is fascinating. I bungled it, but you can go see the original First Amendment by looking at the original Bill of Rights in our Bill of Rights gallery. His vision was one representative for every 30,000 inhabitants, and you say now it's up to 150,000, far beyond what he expected.
But actually, number of voters would be.
Yeah. Josh, same question. It's really important to answer. What would Madison think of Congress today, and how can we resurrect his vision?
I think I always find myself hesitant to try to put words in the mouths of people who've been dead hundreds of years, and also who inhabited a world very different from our own, in a world that we don't particularly want to inhabit. Right? There's a lot that was deeply distasteful and downright evil about the world that Madison not only inhabited but promoted. As far as institution building specifically, I think that he would be confused, but I'm not sure that he would be. And it depends which Madison we're talking about, right? So the Madison of 1787 was perhaps slightly more idealistic than, say, the Madison of 1800. Not to mention the President Madison, right? So the later Madison would have looked at it and said, actually, partisan conflict seems pretty tame today, right? I mean, the Madison who lived through the election of 1800. Would have thought that actually what we call the shenanigans that are going on in Congress today are nothing, right? I mean, 1800 you had the lame duck presidency and Federalist Congress passing putting midnight judges into office, passing the Organic Act for the District of Columbia, and putting all of these Federalists into basically the position of sort of chief law enforcement officer for the District of Columbia. Right? That's the issue that gives rise to Marbury versus Madison. And it sounds sort of anodyne to modern ears, right? Justice of the Peace of the District of Columbia. But these were the cops for the new national capital. And this was right after the French Revolution. And the Jeffersonians were closely identified with the revolutionary French regime, right? Adams and Hamilton actually thought that, if Jefferson and his friends, including Madison, got into office, the streets of Washington might well run red with blood the same way the streets of Paris just had. And Bonaparte was about to be crowned emperor. And they sort of associate all these tendencies with Jefferson. So you get all of these things coming out of the 1800 election that are truly, horrifying. And so to say, Madison would be horrified by the way partisan politics is working today, that's nonsense. He'd look at it and say, that actually seems kind of tame. I think every era has its deep disagreements. Every era has its persistent fights. We seem to have, fewer fistfights than we used to, so that's something. Madison, I think, would sort of look at the way the institution is working, and to the extent that we can sort of put ourselves in his mindset, I think he might say basically what David just said, which is, we sort of sketched out this system of government. I'm kind of shocked it's still going a couple centuries later. Seems to sort of still be working to some extent. He'd be a little annoyed that Hamilton seems to have won the big argument, which is to say we became a big commercial empire rather than a sort of small agrarian republic. But I think overall he'd see the endurance of the institutions that he had a hand in designing.
Wow. Carlton, I want to give you the last word, but let me just set it up this way. You've heard, this is Justice Hulse is going to adjudicate this proposition that both of our scholars, Josh and David, have put forward, which is that it's really not that bad, and Madison would not be that distressed, and it's more or less working as he might have anticipated. You can channel Madison or just compare it to when you started covering Congress in the 80s, but do you agree with our scholars that it's not that bad, or do you think it really is broken, and if it is broken, why, and how can we fix it?
I think the first thing Madison would say is, they did a great job rebuilding that burned down building that happened during my administration.
Yes.
So I tend to say that I think they would come and look at that and say, you know, it's raucous, this is what politics is supposed to be. They're fighting it out. It's hard to imagine that they're still living under the terms of that agreement that we cut. But yeah, I think that, you know, overall we're still this great democracy, and we have some problems right now, and hopefully we'll work through them. And we have in the past. I always say that American politics is very cyclical, and you know, we're in a certain cycle right now. But you know, I'm an optimist. I think that we can rise above it. But I don't think that they would be appalled. I think that this is, you know, there's a little, you know, fisticuffs in politics, and you know, that's the way that people get their decisions made.
This is wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, in addition to constitutional education, the Constitution Center provides constitutional therapy. And you have just heard the 3 leading experts of Congress in America tell us it's a bright day, it's not that bad, let's just be cheerful and have a pep in our heart. Ladies and gentlemen, for brightening our evening, please join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Superb. Go downstairs, please, now and buy these phenomenal books and meet our authors, and see you next week. 2 great town halls. See you then.